Hello adventurers, and welcome to part 2 of my New World War series. In my previous video I covered how to secure a war declaration by winning an influence race. In this video I will dive into the next phase of the war process. We'll focus on how to create a war roster for New World and the essential preparations needed for a successful war. If you're unfamiliar with what war rostering is, it is a process that involves placing players on the war roster at the war board. The war board is located outside of the front of the town hall in each settlement. War rostering is carried out by the governor and the consuls of the involved companies that are competing against each other in the war, or by players designated with the authority to do so. What originally started as company leaders picking players off the war board waiting list has evolved into a complex strategic process. No more last minute plans. Instead, companies do the groundwork in advance, making it possible for more in-depth strategies. In this video, I will explore how to evaluate your company members and available mercenaries on the server to create a formidable war roster. Additionally, we'll discuss other pre-war activities to ensure your team is ready and energized when they step out of the gates onto the war field of battle. Having skilled players is crucial, but without proper rostering and organization, success against a well-prepared opponent is challenging. But on the flip side, for smaller companies with newer players, effective rostering provides the ability to be competitive with most other companies on your server. If you're asking yourself, well, I'm not really part of leadership, should I watch this video? My answer to that is yes, you absolutely should. Even though this video is more targeted towards the leadership of companies out there, understanding the process as a company member will help you succeed as well and set expectations for everyone within the company. You will become a better company member if you understand this process. So whether you're leading a seasoned group or a freshly created company, mastering war rostering is one of those keys to winning. Stick around as we delve into the intricacies of war preparation in New World. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and let me know your thoughts in the comments. Now let's jump into it. All right, let's evaluate the current war meta composition for the current patch. In this Google Sheet, I've laid out an example of a meta war roster with some handy automation to streamline the filling process. I'll make this tool available for all companies to ensure that they're well prepared when creating their army rosters. The link to it will be below in the description of the video. I will dive into the Google Sheet breakdown a bit later, but first, a quick disclaimer. Consider this tool to be a guide, not an exact formula for success. Understanding the core principles allow for flexibility in trying different classes while achieving similar results. In a war, there are 10 groups of 5 players, and the current composition breakdown is as follows. First up, I'm going to highlight it right here. These are groups 1 and 2. These are considered the 2-point groups. Their primary focus is to capture the flag, or what sometimes is commonly referred to as ticking the point or de-ticking the point, depending on which side you are, which creates pressure on the objective. Within the composition of these 2 groups, you can almost think of them as one group, and then you have the 2 individual healers for each of those groups, and you include something like an AoE healer as well. Next, we have the 4 quad groups. So highlighting these groups 3 through 6. Their primary focus is to occupy space in designated quadrants outside of the point. They also assist in point fights and crash when the fight is nearby to them. Their standard composition usually includes 2 bruisers running Great Axe Warhammer, 1 support starting IGVG, 1 flex class that could be anything, and 1 group healer. And if we go down to here, we got groups 7 through 10. These are considered the flex groups. These groups consist of alterations of the quad main ball groups and include Dex group, or commonly referred to groups such as the kill squads. Their primary focus is to play the outer lane and wide fight and to oppose the enemy flex groups as well. Their secondary objective is to crash into the backline support of the opposing army, including the healers or other various support, and to create space for the ally healers by eliminating opposing players that are diving into the backline. Now, don't worry if that is a lot of information and all of it makes sense. When you watch this video, it's going to feel very overwhelming as this is a lot going on within this sheet, and all of it is going to be totally understandable at the first time. In combination with the next few videos that are going to talk about more about war strategy, you might have to revisit this video with that knowledge that you've gained from those videos, kind of combine the two, and then you will slowly but surely understand the war terminology that has developed over the course of time. Now that we've talked about the current war roster composition meta, as we gear up for the upcoming videos where we'll explore more on the group roles during the flag and fort phases, let's take a moment to break down where these teams play positionally. This will set the stage for understanding the principles when rostering your players. Keep in mind these are mental frameworks to enhance the army coordination, serving as starting points rather than strict rules. First up, we have the lanes concept, a method for strategically placing groups across various vertical lanes when attacking or defending the point. This strategy is reminiscent of real war formations, focusing on winning fights on the outer lanes and leveraging those victories into the center. The first lane is called the point lane. This lane is the width of the point and extends out towards the bottom and the top off the point. Players in this lane look to to focus on the war objective of capturing the flag. The top of the lane off the point is considered the opposing army's road, and the bottom of the road off the point is considered the allies' road, or your road. After we have the point lane, we now have the inner lane. The inner lanes, located right outside the point lane, they're roughly about 10 meters in width. It goes from the point lane boundary to the bonfire, about that same distance. The inner lane consists of the 2 quads assigned to each side, so 4 groups in total, each that look to push up the lanes and create space around the objective. The third lane is called the outer lane. It is beyond the inner lane and is roughly 10-ish meters in width. In this lane, fights are less clump organized and more focused on micro plays. Flex groups tend to play here, engaging with opposing flex groups or taking space and diving into the enemy backline when opportunities arise. The fourth and last lane is called the wide lane, situated outside of the outer lane and about 20-ish plus meters away from the point. This is where the bows and dex players tend to play. Although far from the point objective, this area is crucial as bows can achieve high value if left unattended. The wide lane tends to have a reoccurring 5v5 encounter with the opposing wide lane decks. Now that we have a general idea of the lanes concept, we'll move into the quads concept. This concept emerged as a countermeasure against Zergs forming on the point. By spreading out the main quad groups around the point or objective, players could take space and crash from various angles and effectively become a Zerg when needed while avoiding Zerging when unnecessary. This is how it works. In lane quad groups, they transfer their play into the respective quads. For example, G5 takes the top left quad, G3 takes the bottom left quad, G6 takes the top right quad, and G4 takes the bottom right quad. Either groups do not play via the quad system. This is solely to the 4 quad groups. The emphasis here is to take space in these areas and spread out the main army strategically around the objective, and then when the timing is right, these groups break from their quads and crash onto the objective or form larger player clumps right off the point. When in doing so, they can get a lot of value and then go back to their quads, effectively undeserving. These are the 2 main principles essential for war strategy positioning, so we'll start off with just understanding those 2. Now that we have a general understanding of where groups play throughout the war, we can take a look at the war rostering of those groups. The first thing I always hear about the meta is that the meta is meant to be broken, and in a 50-50 war with so many variables, I cannot agree more with this idea. But I do believe, however, that starting from a place of tried and tested is a good way to set yourself up for success as a starting point. It's harder to be a meta breaker if you don't already see the nuances and how the pieces work together to already create success in order to break that system and try something new. A quick overview of how the tool works now. We have columns for roles, armor weights, weapons, heart runes, the player's name within the game itself, their in-game name, and if they're in the company, because you can only have so many Mercs available to you, Mercenaries. You go to click down for the role, you can see a few of the role options that I've pre-made in here. You can also adjust these. The armor weights have the 3 armor weights. The weapons have each of the individual weapons. Heart runes have all the heart runes, and then you would just type in name of player into the player name, so that'd be their in-game name. So for example, Druid, right? So, and then you can do yes or no if that person's in the company or not. Now let's hop into the groups. So group 1 and group 2 are considered the 2-point groups, as we talked about. They usually go up the point lane. These groups, there hasn't been much changing or playing around with these groups at this point. They've become fairly normalized or standardized. A large part of that being that when you take the 6 players, the tank, the support, the bruiser support, over here in the group 2, they're put together as one group. So you would have the 6 players, and that's considered a pretty solid number. If you go any more than that and have like a 3rd point group, for instance, making group 3 another point group, you start to bring in too much of a large Zerg, and then the overall amount of people on the point can sometimes be too much. There is examples of sometimes having a 3rd point group, and if that favors your war style, that's something to evaluate. Is you can mimic, for instance, group 2, put it onto group 3 and have kind of a similar setup. So one of the things that defines the point groups is the tank. Having a tank that's in heavy armor, sword and shield to give that extra fortify bonus. That's usually one of the primary staples. Usually gets put in group 1, not necessarily in the second group. You don't usually have more than 1 tank, just because that extra fortify is not necessarily needed and one can do the job for you. It's very similar to the AoE healer. You don't really need more than one of them. It becomes kind of redundant. What you'll also notice is that their armor weights tend to be a little bit heavier. Right now, I have the tank in the support in heavy right here. Supports in heavy on this side in group 2. Now the bruisers are in medium because they get a little bit more of a damage increase here from being in medium armor, similar to how that would be in a normal quad group. But for example, something you could change is you could then make these medium bruisers go heavy and have a little bit more survivability. The idea is having the point groups be about survivability and being on the objective and being able to play life and having the tools and abilities to do so. So that's an example for that. Another common thing that usually gets put in the point groups is the one AoE healer. The one AoE healer is just a very high healing, high focus player who's looking to create a whole bunch of healing in a single point where the main clump fights kind of occur, where the crash points kind of occur. And that person's just going to throw heals in that area, and it's going to be the anti-disease, the anti-burst person that kind of levels it out so that the healers of the players that are jumping into that crash can kind of stabilize those players after they exit the crash or during the crash itself. Another variation that could be used here is, instead of having the two AoE healers, we could go maybe two DST healers here on each group. These DST healers could help keep up the three in their group a lot more efficiently by communicating who they're going after. This just makes sure a single target heal is always available to those players. And so this is an example of a way that you can kind of alter the healers within those two groups. One thing I did in here as well is I typed in the war shot caller. You got to find a kind of a group to put your war shot caller in. This is the person who's calling the crashes and telling the groups what to do, paying attention to respawns, etc. And so generally you want that person in more of a support role where they can live. And so in this example, I just put that person as the heavy void ice gauntlet. Having the ice gauntlet for kind of an escape is great to have, but you can look to maybe use the flail. For example, you could put the shot caller in this spot, right, and put him with the flail and the void gauntlet here. And so this is another example. You did see earlier that I had this originally as a disruptor. This disruptor is a medium spear, sword and shield. This is kind of a role that we can kind of play around with. This fourth role within some of these groups is kind of a very flexible type area. So in this case, I have a disruptor. This could look something like maybe a damage fire staff user who's pumping out with his blunderbuss some version of, you know, disease, right? And so this could be like a disease pestilence player who's supporting the clumps, right? And so some metas will have this player just straight support the points, or in some metas what's going to happen is that this fourth player in every group, so this one, what they're going to do, also group 5 and group 6 here, that those players, those 5 players are going to come together to kind of creating an 11th group within the war roster. And so that's an example of what might possibly happen as well. So something to play around with. Going into the quad groups, generally I would recommend to kind of keep the compositions the same as well here, at least for the first 3 spots. Having the 2 bruisers and the 1 support VGIG is just a great combination of these 3 players that are able to take space and kind of take ownership of their quads, as well as when needed create a nice little punch to like jump into the crashes and do a lot of damage all in one go. And generally we're going to have these healers all be running Splash of Light. Splash of Light generally is called clap within the community. It's just a shorthand, just because the animation looks like you're clapping together. The 4th player, again, like in these groups, this depends on how the meta has evolved in each of the areas or servers you're a part of. I've seen lots of different examples here. So in NA West, for example, you will see fire staffs that are heavy armor and they're just going to be flamethrowing their particular quadrant, right? So these might look like, you know, you have a heavy fire staff and blunderbuss player, and like similar to this one here in group 5, and you just have them play within their quads and they're looking to throw pestilence, which, you know, disease to the healers or the clumps that are most associated to those quads, right? So whenever it kind of gets close to them, they're just going to spray it down with fire. And another example that might be coming out of that is having a disruptor base class. So you can have a disruptor, and this could be a spear SNS or a great sword SNS, or just something that can be kind of taking up space as well as looking to go after maybe the support or healers in the area. So someone that can kind of break away and go after maybe targets that can kind of kill or interrupt, and that's what it's trying to do here. And so within kind of that same theme of bringing into the 11th group, you know, these 4 players can be kind of thought of as well within your rostering decisions, is if you want to combine them into a 11th group, right? And so you can kind of consider each of the 5 positions and try to create a unique group that combos between all those 5 spots. Some other considerations: armor weights. Generally, most of these bruisers are going to be playing in medium. If you play in heavy out here, you're not going to be able to see as much damage when it comes to the crashes. and you're going to suffer a little bit in terms of that. So you really kind of want to avoid putting heavy bruisers in these quad groups at the moment. If you have a heavy bruiser or someone who has heavy bruiser gear, try to throw them on the point group if that's probably your best option, because their main identity is to help out support and throw out the abilities and make sure they're just kind of securing the kills that are happening. They generally can go heavy and escape and play life a little bit easier, and then kind of go in and out a little bit easier given their weapon choices. So that's generally kind of always going to stay that same way. So that's generally what the quads feel like, and that's generally how you can kind of play around with them. It's usually just going to be kind of messing around with that, you know, fourth role that's kind of a flex role that you can kind of play around with and do some interesting things with. The healers, you're not going to want to put an AoE healer here for sure. It needs to be a group healer of some sort. So that leaves you with three kind of options here. You got the clap, you got the double single target healer, or you can run a beacon healer. Now beacon is kind of, it's helpful, and then you'll see some teams are running back left and back right quads that have beacon healers because they're able to pull away more from a little bit of fighting, and they're not as hindered by it. But I think with the way that people are fighting nowadays, I think having clap is just such a great way to go. And most healers, especially if you're just trying to start off and create a new roster, or you're trying to figure things out, is start from an area where you have all these healers running splash of light, or clap as it's known. That's going to help out a lot more. Going beacon, that's not going to be very helpful. Double single target is a very high skill ceiling, so if players are capable of reaching that skill ceiling, then go for it, but it's just not going to be as common for every healer to be capable of doing so. So let's go into the last four groups here, the flex groups. So the flex groups, there's a lot to play with here. The combinations I put out here are having two disruptors, which is basically acts as like the two bruisers, but just with like more of the utility of being able to kind of chase down targets and interrupt them, rather than being like fully looking to punch out a clump or destroy the clump. Meta for like these assassin style builds right now is that you can play heavy armor because it doesn't have so much of an effect on your damage as most people think it will. It just kind of affects your base damage, but of course when you utilize the utility in your weapons and perks and whatnot, you're able to kind of still get a good amount of damage out there and take down target, as well as having all the wins of having heavy armor. So generally, if you have disruptors playing out here with these flex groups, you want them to be playing heavy armor. There's so much positives rather than negatives. So if you're just starting off, now of course, if you want, you can look at maybe having a few of these go medium, but if you are a newer company, again, I'm going to emphasize that you go with the easier option, just go with the heavy armor until there's some changes made. Even with the stamina changes, it's still very valuable. What you'll notice next then is having the 2 damage that kind of follow up on this. So instead of having like a support and then kind of a 4th flex class, both of the spots are going to be oriented towards following up on those disruptors and making sure that you can kill targets quickly and efficiently. That's kind of what you're looking at across here. One thing you're going to notice about these groups is the way I have it set up, and you can kind of check it out if I have a small little diagram off to the side to kind of show this, and we'll kind of try and keep it in right here, right? Is that group 7 is considered what's called weak side protection. You'll understand this a little bit more when we get to the strategy aspect of my next video, when we talk about the point phase and how we fight in the point phase. But basically they've kind of play on what's an easier side to play on most of the time. They're usually kind of versing another weak side protection flex group. This group is not so much about playing in the ranged area. It's more of a mid-range close-up kind of style, right? So that's why you don't see bows, for example. It's mostly sword and shield and fire staffs with some other utility weapons on their offhands. Whereas when we go into group 10 over here, this flex group, this is more what I would call like the wide fight group. Now this wide fight group has 2 bows in it because we are playing super far away with this group, and they're looking to get advantage by having that range and attacking from ranged. And then we have 2 groups, 8 and 9, that are 2 flex groups, and they are what we call the strong side dive groups. Similar to the flex group that's protecting the weak side, they're going to have the 2 disruptors to kind of follow up on, and they have the 2 damaged. Then they have the 2 damage oriented specs that are following up on the disruptors. Now this is where you can kind of play a little bit more, is these 2 in each of these flex groups that are kind of playing not so much in that inner fight where 3 and 5 are playing, but more in that outer fight, 8 and 9. That outer lane, depending on the play style of your groups, you can play around with these. It could be something like maybe that this could be like a 3rd disruptor, for example, and this could be, you know, a whole group of sword and shields looking to come after targets and breaking down groups by just diving into them, while this group is more oriented towards having range, right? So like this bow and rapiers here, or this fire staff and blunderbuss, both in light armor. This is in a place where maybe you might want to put another bow right here. You can go bow and rapier again and have 2 more bows like the same thing you would have in your flex group on the wide fight. You could also possibly mix in a musket, for example. This is a great place to put a musket because the musket can kind of play more mid-rangey if they would like to choose, or they can kind of back away. I'd probably pair the musket with maybe like a fire staff too and a blunderbuss, just to have something that's more mid-range for the disruptors to play with and have a little bit more damage pressure. So that has some general thoughts and principles on how to use this roster as a guideline. And what you will have to experiment with is switching out and playing with these different combinations with your company members, and then look to kind of fill in with mercs that you have, right? So if you have an attack, you get 25 merc slots, and if you have a defense, then you get 10 merc slots. And so you can fill in this template, if you want to call it that, or tool with those merc slots where you're missing things. Now, if you're trying to purposely use mercs, which is always a good idea, I think people should use mercs to, especially if you're a newer company, to help you advance and have some people that can kind of teach you or lead the way for the group. That's never a bad idea. There's a couple different ideas you can go. You could have different mercs in different groups, like one merc goes into, you know, one of these groups, right? And then you have another merc going, a single merc going to this group. And so that way you kind of have an extra little bit of leadership in each of those group. So if you pick out certain players that kind of help with that, that's super great. And that will really advance the abilities of your group to perform well and kind of the expectations of your group. Another option is that you could fully merc out one squad too. So you can merc out one squad. This whole entire group could then be consisted of war veteran type players who know how to play the game really well and can create a single point of ease for your company to work off of. I normally would not say make them like in the quad group. Generally, a good starting place if you need help and are struggling is to start off with your point groups. Have kind of the point groups be the center focal point of people that play the game for a while. These will make it easier for you to live as a company, and the quad groups can then work off the point group. It's harder for the quad groups to survive if the point group is just absolutely gone. Now, obviously, flex groups, very impactful in wars. If you can merc certain players for these flex groups, including certain bows or fire staffs of very high performing players or even disruptors, then that is an extreme positive, right? And most of the time, this is where I'm going to see a lot of mercs play, just because there's certain people that just can swing these so heavily with their skill sets. Normally, you'll see a lot of players merc in these areas compared to the main army being groups 1 through 6. Yeah, so that is the general idea. That's the general idea of this. I could go further into different metas. I don't want to skew it too far to make you feel like you have to go a certain way. I have this example template set up so that you can use this as kind of a guide or reference, but you have to do the work to look at your company and evaluate what you can kind of go for and make decisions based on that. And hopefully you'll kind of have a better idea of like what you need to change or what works for your company based on the next videos when we talk about strategy. Okay, now that was a lot, I know. And so let's finish out with some quick war prep topics. We're going to start out with the war consumables. Now, while the ownership of giving out consumables isn't normally on the company anymore, it falls to the company leadership to make sure everyone has the needed war consumables for the war before it starts. The consumables to check for and make sure that you have are the tier 5 hearty meal for health regen and the tier 5 energizing hearty meal for increased mana regen, tier 5 attribute food to get the plus 48 attributes, tier 5 powerful honing stone for the plus 7% weapon damage, tier 5 desert sunrise to reduce dots by 17.5%. A few other things I have extras of just in case are the tier 5 regeneration serums, tier 5 infused both mana and regen potions. Some other optional things to have that aren't really necessarily used all the time but are good just to have just in case anyone needs them is the tier 5 powerful incense for increased resistance to afflictions by 50. This includes things like poison, disease, bleeds, frostbite. Tier 5 infused fire, arcana, or other elemental based absorption pods for the old style fortify. Most players will bring these in themselves, but sometimes they forget and we'll need a couple extras. And the last optional consumable is the tier 5 powerful gemstone dust and the powerful oak flesh balm. Having extras of these to give out before the war starts is very important, and you should check in with your war roster during the initial 15-minute preparation phase to make sure they have everything they need. Assigning console to give them out will be the best way to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to get the consumables they need before the war starts. Now let's talk about the last piece of war prerequisites, the communication setup. This is a crucial factor, especially for newer companies entering the war scene. Effective micro communication within groups is vital to minimize deaths in a war. Cruisers and supports need to avoid committing to fights without backup, otherwise confidence in taking on smaller engagements as well as larger engagements can be compromised. Lacking micro communication inhibits healer to melee coordination, preventing the front line from playing with the assurance of timely healing. Let's break down two sets of communication involved. First, we have what's called macro comms, or the main comms of a war. This is where the shot caller provides large-scale communication to the entire army. All players must have this communication in their ears at all time. Exception to this is that the healers, however, may choose not to have this in their ears to maintain focus on their group-specific comms for healing. Second is the micro comms, or the side comms. They're limited to the 5 members within the group, or 10 if there's coordinated groups like the point or kill squad teams. It is not recommended to exceed 5, as too many voices can lead to a higher level of confusion and less information. Microcomms is typically led by the bruiser, but if the support or the healer who has more macro view of the whole entire war going on wants to help assist with the calling, that is helpful as well. Now, how do we set these communications? The most common method for macro comms is to use Discord as one instance of communication. For the micro or the side comms, what a lot of people do is they have a second Discord open. So one Discord would be open in the application on your computer, and the second would be in the browser, so that you can have 2 instances of Discord going at the same time. Another approach is having your macro comms in Discord and then your micro comms in TeamSpeak. A lot of competitive companies use this due to its whisper system, which allows for ease of communicating across the different groups. Having a solid communication setup is paramount for effective war coordination. And to finish out, I just want to go over a quick checklist that you should do before every war starts. First thing you need to check is check your gear for correct stats and perks. So you basically going through and making sure that you have no other gear sets on or no PvE gear that's on by accident from doing any of the mutation engines. Number 2, check your consumables. Make sure that you have all of the potions on your consumable bar that you want. Double check that you bought cleanses from the store. Cleanses is a huge part of the war right now. Number 3, check your attribute points. So check if you have the full attributes you normally would have. If you're missing any, it could be you didn't assume the attribute food or that your gear is incorrect in some way. So you have to go back and double check that. Number 4, check your weapon mastery points. Same thing as your attributes. These get changed around when you play their classes or switch between PvP and PvE. So just double check that you have the right masteries. And number 5, check your communication setup for your micro communication and your macro communication, and make sure you don't have people muted or that you don't have yourself muted so that everyone can hear you. Now that rounds out my guide for war rostering and war prep. I know that was a ton of information, and again, don't worry if it's overwhelming. Please go back again and watch the video if you need to like go over anything, or if you have any questions, please comment down below and I'll add any clarification. The most important thing to me though is that we share this knowledge with as many people as possible. So if you can share that with other people, that would be greatly appreciated. Again, hope this information was full, and best of luck adventurers in Aeternum, and can't wait to see you guys out there.